In proportion as we consider the history of mankind, or even of individual man, from the Catholic or the Protestant point of view, very different conclusions will in part be formed respecting our common progenitor, conclusions which will affect the destinies of his whole race, even to their passage into the next life. And even the first degrees of that life take a very different form, according as we regard them in the light either of Catholic or of Protestant doctrine. The parties indeed originally were not conscious of the full extent of their divisions. For ecclesiastical, like political revolutions, are not conducted according to a preconcerted, fully completed system, but on the contrary, their fundamental principles are wont to be consistently unfolded only in and by practical life, and their heterogeneous parts to be thereby only gradually transformed. Hence, at the commencement of the ecclesiastical revolution of the 16th century, reflection was not immediately directed towards the origin of our kind, nor even to its passage into eternity. For a more minute explanation of these articles of doctrine appeared in part to possess but a very subordinate interest, and many points seemed only brought forward to fill up the breaches in the general system of belief. The great contest which now engages our attention had rather its rise in the inmost and deepest centre of human history, as it turned upon the mode whereby fallen man can regain fellowship with Christ and become a partaker of the fruits of redemption. But from this centre the opposition spread backward and forward and reached the two terms of human history which were necessarily viewed in accordance with the changes introduced in the central point. The more consistently a system is carried out, and the more harmoniously it is framed, the more will any modification in its fundamental principle shake all its parts. Whoever, therefore, in its centre assailed Catholicism, whose doctrines are all most intimately intertwined, was forced by degrees to attack many other points also, whose connection with those first combated was in the beginning scarcely imagined. We could now have started from the real centre of all these disputes, and have shown how all doctrines have been seized and drawn into its circle. And undoubtedly the commencement of our work would have much more excited the interest of the reader had we immediately placed him in the midst of the contest and enabled him to survey the entire field which the battle commands. But we conceive that the controverted doctrines may be stated in a simpler and more intelligible manner when we pursue the contrary course, and by following the clue presented by the natural progress of human history, bring under notice these doctrinal differences. Hence we begin with the original state of man, speak next of his fall and the consequences thereof, and then enter on the very central ground of the controversy as we proceed to consider the doctrine of the restoration of man from his fall through Christ Jesus. We shall afterwards point out the influence of the conflicting doctrines respecting the origin and nature of the internal life of those united with Christ, on their external union and communion with each other, and thus be led to enlarge on the theory and essence of this outward communion, according to the views of the different confessions. And we shall conclude with the passage of individuals from this communion existing on earth to that of the next world, as well as with the lasting mutual intercourse between the two. The first point, accordingly, which will engage our attention is the primitive state of man. Fallen man, as such, is able in no other wise, save by the teaching of divine revelation, to attain to the true and pure knowledge of his original condition. For it was a portion of the destiny of man, when alienated from his God, to be likewise alienated from himself, and to know with certainty neither what he originally was, nor what he became. In determining his original state, we must especially direct our view to the renewal of the fallen creature in Christ Jesus, because as regeneration consists in the re-establishment of our primeval condition, and this transformation and renewal is only the primitive creation restored, the insight into what Christ hath given us back affords us the desired knowledge of what in the origin was imparted to us. This course has been at all times and by all parties pursued when the original condition of man was to be traced. As regards the Catholic dogma, this embraces the whole spiritual as well as corporeal existence of the paradisaic man, extending not only to his preeminent endowments of soul and body, but to those gifts which he possessed in common with all men, so far at least as the doctrinal controversies of the 16th century required a special explanation on this latter point. Accordingly, in the higher portion of his nature, he is described as the image of God, that is to say, as a spiritual being, endowed with freedom, capable of knowing and loving God, and of viewing everything in him. As Adam had this divine similitude in common with the whole human race, the distinction which he enjoyed herein consisted in his being what the simple expression of the Council of Trent denominates just and holy, in other words, completely acceptable to God. Or as a school says, in language however not quite expressive enough, his inferior faculties of soul and bodily impulses acted unresistingly under the guidance of his reason, and therefore everything in him was in obedience to reason, as his reason was in obedience to God. And accordingly, he lived in blessed harmony with himself and with his Maker. The action of the faculties and impulses of the body was in perfect accord with a reason devoted to God, and shunned all conflict with it. It was, moreover, coupled with the great gift of immortality, even in man's earthly part, as well as with an exemption from all the evils and all the maladies which are now the ordinary preludes to death. The ideal moral state in which Adam existed in paradise, the theologians of antiquity knew by the name of original justice. On the notion and nature whereof it will be proper to make some other remarks, partly of an historical kind, in order to explain the opposition which, in this article of doctrine, the Catholic Church has had to encounter from the Protestants. The essential and universal interest of the Christian religion in determining the original condition of our common progenitor is by the above stated brief doctrine of the Church amply satisfied. Herein consists the interest, on one hand, to guard against evil in the world being attributed to a divine cause, and the dogma of the supreme holiness of God, the creator of the world, being disfigured, and on the other hand, to establish on a solid basis the principle of a totally unmerited redemption from the fall, that practical fundamental doctrine of Christianity, by most earnestly inculcating that God had endowed the first man with the noblest gifts, and that thus it was only through his own deep self-guiltiness he fell. Upon both points, however, there exist more stringent and by no means superfluous definitions of the Church. Theologians likewise, taking as their standard the ecclesiastical doctrine, clearly based as it is on scripture and tradition, and following certain hints which particular passages of Holy Writ and some dogmas appear to furnish, having endeavoured to fathom more deeply the nature of original justice. And the Church has viewed with pleasure the attention and love bestowed on the consideration of the holy work, and permitted, within the determined limits which revelation itself has marked out, the freest scope to speculation. When the Church attributes to Adam, in his original state, holiness and justice, she by no means merely means that he has unpolluted with any alloy adverse to God or contrary to his natural impulse and bearing to God, but what is far more, that he stood in the most interior and the closest communion with his Maker. Now it is an universal truth, holding good of all, even the highest orders and circles of intellectual creatures, that such a relation to God as that of the paradisaic man is no wise to be attained and upheld by natural powers, that consequently a special condescension of the Almighty is required thereto. In short, that no finite being is holy, save by the Holy and Sanctifying Spirit. That no finite being can exist in a living moral communion with the Deity, save by the communion of the self-same Holy Spirit. This relation of Adam to God, as it exalted him above human nature and made him participate in that of God, is hence termed, as indeed such a denomination is involved in the very idea of such an exaltation, a supernatural gift of divine grace, superadded to the endowments of nature. Moreover, this more minute explanation of the dogma concerning the original holiness and justice of Adam is not merely a private opinion of theologians, but an integral part of that dogma, and hence itself a dogma. The following observation will not perhaps appear unimportant. So often as from a mere philosophical point of view, we mean to say so often as without regard to or knowledge of revealed truth, the relation of the human spirit to God hath been more deeply investigated, men have seen themselves forced to the adoption of a homoousia, or equality of essence between the divine and the human nature, in other words, to embrace pantheism, and with it the most arrogant deification of man. How, on the other hand, the doctrinal system of the Catholic Church obviates the objections of pantheism, and, while filled with the spirit of humility, satisfies those cravings after a more profound science, which a profane pantheistic philosophy vainly endeavours to supply, is apparent from what has been above stated. What man as a creature, by the energy of his own nature abandoned to itself, was unable to attain, is conferred on him as a grace from his Creator. So exceedingly great is the goodness and love of God. The blessing above described, which knit the bonds of an exalted, holy and happy communion between God and the paradisaic man, is founded on the supposition that a struggle would by degrees have naturally arisen between the sensual and the spiritual nature of man, characterized by many theologians as that power whereby the sensual and supersensual parts of Adam were maintained in undisturbed harmony. The same divines necessarily suppose that on Adam the supernatural gifts were bestowed simultaneously with his natural endowments. That is to say, that both were conferred at the moment of his creation. Other theologians, on the other hand, distinguishing undoubtedly between justice and holiness, prefer the opinion that Adam was created as a sound, pure, unpolluted nature, with the harmonious relation of all his parts, and that he was favoured with the supernatural gift of a holy and blessed communion with God at a later period only, to wit, when he had prepared for its reception, and by his own efforts had rendered himself worthy of its participation. This latter opinion possesses the advantage of more accurately distinguishing between the two orders of nature and grace, and is moreover recommended by the fact that what nature is in itself, and what it is enabled to accomplish of itself, is pointed out with great clearness, that the spiritual nature of man, as being in its essence the image of God, hath the faculty and the aptitude to know and to love him, nay, that to a certain extent it is of itself really capable of loving him, and that the desire after the full union with the deity is a want inherent in his very nature, are truths very well pointed out in this theory. Thus the natural and necessary points of contact for the higher communications of grace are here very finely brought out. The same opinion also distinguishes Adam's original justice from his internal sanctity and acceptance before God, considering the former to be the attribute of pure nature, as it came from the hand of the Creator, the latter to be only the gift of supernatural grace. The advocates of this opinion are thus in a condition successively to prove that it was not the creation as such which gave occasion to any incongruity in the relation of man to God, any interruption of the former's freedom, but that every such incongruity, every such disturbance, had its rise only in the abuse of freedom. Further, this theory significantly implies that without any antagonism of evil, man could yet have attained to the consciousness of his own nature and the wants extending beyond it, as well as of the manifestations of divine favour and grace, a doctrine which is of the highest importance. Lastly, the possible condition of man after his fall and the course of his conversion and regeneration are here prefigured. Moreover, both these opinions regard the justice and sanctity of Adam as accidental qualities. The Council of Trent has not pronounced itself either for or against either of them, but has employed such expressions that both may coexist within the pale of the Church. The first declaration of the Council regarding our great progenitor was couched in the following terms: the justice and sanctity wherein he, Adam, was created, conditus. This form was afterwards insofar modified that instead of the word created, that of established, constitutus, was selected. Luther by no means called in question the fact that Adam was positively holy and just. On the contrary, he was totally unacquainted with the later negative conceptions of a state of mere innocency, an indifference between good and evil, wherein the paradisaic man is represented to have existed, and was accordingly far removed from those opinions which make the doctrine of the fall a foolishness, and make the human race adopt a course which is the necessary entrance into evil in order to serve as a transition to a self-conscious return to good. Unhappily, he fell into other errors which, considered in their consequences, outweigh at least those we have mentioned. Respecting original justice, Luther brought no new and peculiar views into vogue. He only selected out of the rich store of theories which the fruitfulness of scholasticism had produced, the one which seemed most favourable to his own opinions, handled it with no great dexterity, and in the form which it assumed under his hands, interwove it in such a way into his whole system of doctrine that the latter without it cannot be at all understood. Hence, it is only later that its full importance in the whole Lutheran system will become perceptible. Against those theologians who called Adam's acceptableness before God supernatural, Luther asserted it to be natural. And in opposition to the schoolmen who regarded it as accidental, he conceived it to be essential to human nature, an integral and constitutive part of the same, esse de natura de essentia hominis. He meant to say the pure nature of man as it sprang forth at the omnipotent word of the Creator, comprised absolutely in itself all the conditions to render it pleasing unto God, that the various parts of Adam's nature, by the peculiar energy inherent in them, were maintained in the most beautiful harmony, and the whole man preserved in his due relation to God. The religious faculty, especially of the first man, in virtue of an inborn fullness of energy, expanded itself in a way acceptable to the deity, so that, without any supernatural aid, he truly knew God, believed in him, loved him perfectly, and was holy. The religious and moral disposition of Adam, together with its practical development, the Reformers called the image of God, without drawing any distinction between the bare faculty itself and the exercise of that faculty in correspondency to the divine will. From the very fact that Adam possessed this faculty, he was, according to them, truly religious, truly pious, devoted in all things to God and his holy will, and perfectly united with him. Catholic theologians, on the other hand, distinguished very exactly between the one and the other, so that to determine rightly the distinction they commonly termed the religious faculty, the image of God, but the pious exertion of that faculty, the likeness unto God. We shall later see what mighty consequences were involved in these, at the first view, trifling doctrinal differences that seemed merely to concern the schools. And we must, in the meanwhile, prepare ourselves to expect on the part of Luther a most singular doctrine respecting original sin. Moreover, the non-distinction adverted to had partly its foundation in the endeavour of the Reformers to be in their teaching very practical and very intelligible. Hence they avoided with as much care as possible all distinctions and abstract expressions as a scholastic abuse, but thereby frequently fell into a strange and most pernicious confusion of ideas. The second main point of difference between the two confessions in the matter under discussion is the doctrine of free will. Luther asserted, and he would have this assertion maintained as an article of faith, that man is devoid of freedom, that every pretended free action is only apparent, that an irresistible divine necessity rules all things, and that every human act is at bottom only the act of God. Melanchthon taught the same. He also comprised all things in a circle of an unavoidable necessity and predestination, declared the doctrine that God is the sole agent to be a necessary part of all Christian science, for thereby the wisdom and cunning of human reason were duly repressed and condemned. And he repeatedly insisted that the word freedom of election was unknown to Scripture, and that its meaning must be rejected by the judgment of the spiritual man. He added that this expression, like the very pernicious word reason, to which he declared equal hostility, had been introduced through philosophy into the Christian Church. From no other cause did he deem himself so well justified in daring to apply to the professors of the theological faculties in the Middle Age, the so-called schoolmen, the terms sophists, theologues, and the like, as an account of their crime in having established among Christians the doctrine of human free will so firmly that, as he complained, it was scarcely any longer possible to root it out. Perceiving after more diversified experience and maturer reflection, especially after the controversy with the Catholics, the prodigious abyss into which such a doctrine must precipitate the Church, he subsequently abandoned and even combated it. On the other hand, we are unacquainted with any such recantation on the part of Luther, and the Formulary of Concord gives an express sanction to the writing of Luther against Erasmus. This doctrine of the servitude of the human will has had the greatest weight, and its influence, according to Melanchthon's assurance, pervades even the whole religious system of the Lutherans. In regard to the original constitution of the human body, both confessions are agreed, and if the Lutheran formularies speak not expressly of that property of Adam's body, whereby if he had never sinned, he would have remained exempt from death, this silence is to be ascribed to the total absence of all controversy on the matter. In enlarging on the spiritual condition of the paradisaic man, Calvin, by representing it, with Luther, as one devoid of supernatural graces, set himself up in opposition to the Catholic Church. But by expressly ascribing to the first man the gift of free will, he equally opposed the Lutherans. In other respects, we find in this article no difference of doctrine, and the same remark will hold good of the confessions of the Reformed churches. In respect to the injurious consequences produced by the sin of our first parent on his corporeal existence and that of his posterity, most of the formularies of the Reformed expressly teach with Calvin that death is the fruit of Adam's transgression. But the question here occurs, how Calvin could feel himself justified in attributing free will to Adam, when, in common with Zwingli, he completely shared Luther's doctrine touching a divine necessity of all occurrences, and even pushed this opinion to the extremist verge. Conscious of this discrepancy, he observes undoubtedly that the question as to the mysterious predestination of God is here unseasonably mooted, for the matter at issue is not what could have happened, but how man was originally constituted. In despite of this express demand to hold the two doctrines distinct, that of a divine necessity, of an absolute eternal destiny, which enchains and holds all things together, and that of the freedom of man prior to his fall, we are at a loss to discover how this claim can be satisfied. For these two doctrines are in fact incompatible, and with the adoption of the one, the other must be abandoned, unless to the word freedom a notion be attached which in reality destroys its very existence. And such is really the case, for, as we shall have occasion to show, Calvin evidently, after Luther's example, makes not inward necessity, but outward constraint the opposite to freedom. On the other hand, Melanchthon has expressed himself openly and honestly on the mutual correlativeness of these two articles of doctrine, and declared that from that very correlativeness they should be simultaneously treated. We shall find, moreover, that Calvin even teaches an eternal, immutable predestination of the fall of the first man, an opinion which is certainly quite incompatible with the proposition that Adam was free, that is to say, could have avoided sinning. Hence it has happened that, Though some symbolical writings of the Reformed communities have with Calvin expressly ascribed free will to Adam, others have judged it more expedient in what they teach respecting the paradisaic man to pass this matter over in silence, and this was evidently the most consistent course. We think it still proper to direct attention to the internal reasons which Calvin alleged in behalf of the doctrine of an absolute necessity destructive of all human freedom, partly because it will then follow that it ought not, at least absolutely and immediately, to be confounded with the pagan fatum, and partly because a knowledge of this reasoning will be of importance in later investigations. If Melanchthon, after indulging in harsh assertions, could assign no other practical ground for this doctrine than that the relation of man towards God adverted to was very useful towards subduing human arrogance, Calvin, on the other hand, observed that the knowledge not merely that God guided the affairs of the world in small as in great things, but that nothing whatever could occur without the express ordinance of God, destinante Deo, comprised a very abundant source of consolation, for it is only in this way man feels himself secure in the hands of an all-wise, all-ruling, powerful and indulgent Father. Hence the idea of a divine permission and such a conduct of things that ultimately everything, even evil in the world, conduces to the benefit of those who serve God, did not satisfy him. He believed the elect insecure and the notion of a divine providence not sufficiently defined, unless, for example, the assaults of the enemy on an elect were absolutely willed and ordained by God. Moreover, even the public confessions of the Reformed occasionally adopt this view, which Calvin here enforces, of the providential guidance of all things, mitigating considerably, however, this opinion and evincing a very laudable dread of stamping on their articles the harsh spirit of Calvin. By the latter, however, as well as by his disciple Theodore Beza, the opinions adverted to respecting divine providence were held with such tenacity and carried out with such consistency that they found it a matter of extreme difficulty to convince the world. Nay, and despite of all their eloquence and dialectic art, they utterly failed to convince very many that they did not in fact refer all evil to God. We are bound to enter more fully into the investigation of this subject. In all the more important doctrinal manuals and polemical writings of the 16th and 17th centuries, in the works of Bellarmine, Beckernus, Chemnitz, Gerhardt, and others, nay, even in several public confessions, the reader meets with a special and copious chapter bearing the title of the present section on the cause of moral evil. As in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Church, no writer could enlarge on the religious concerns of his time without entering upon the question, whence is evil? So the same question was now again most anxiously investigated, and it soon became apparent that the opposition between Catholicism and Protestantism could not be duly appreciated, and that the inmost essence of the latter would remain eternally misconceived if the different replies which had been made to that question were not well considered. No subject in the first times of the Reformation so embittered the Catholics against the authors of that revolution as their doctrine respecting the relation wherein the deity stands to moral evil. It was precisely on this account the Catholic Church laid down again, with so much earnestness and emphatic energy, the proposition that man was created with the endowment of freedom, in order that, without any restriction, and without subterfuge, the guilt of evil in the world might fall on the head of man. For the denial of free will on the part of Luther, Melanchthon, Zwingli and Calvin was calculated to excite an apprehension that, in consequence thereof, the Catholic doctrine of God's perfect sanctity, to whom sin is an abomination, would be thrown into the shade, and on the other hand, that even the most vicious man would be thus sheltered from all responsibility. And in fact, Melanchthon, in his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans, in the edition of the year 1525, had the hardihood to assert that God wrought all things, evil as well as good, that he was the author of David's adultery and the treason of Judas, as well as of Paul's conversion. Now, however strange and prejudiced a notion an individual may have formed of the errors of the Catholic Church, we ask him, would he dare to assert that all these errors put together can outweigh the single enormity here uttered by Melanchthon? And yet Chemnitz, to whom we are indebted for the original passages in question, for in the later editions of Melanchthon's aforesaid work they have disappeared, Chemnitz, we say, excuses his teacher Melanchthon. And how does he excuse him? In so complicated a matter, he says, among other things, all in the beginning could not be systematically and properly treated, more especially as, on the part of Catholics, the doctrine of free will had been exaggerated. Just as if the question, whence is evil, had only in the 16th century first excited attention. Just as if Holy Writ left us at all in doubt how that question was to be answered. Just as if in the 2nd and 3rd centuries the question had not been really settled by the Church. However, in this matter, Melanchthon merely spoke after Luther, as the writing of the latter against Erasmus will show. But it was Melanchthon's assertion the Council of Trent had in view when it anathematized the proposition that God works evil as well as good, and that it is not in the power of man to abstain from wickedness. In proportion, however, as the notions which the Saxon reformers, especially Melanchthon, had entertained respecting free will became purer, they abandoned the opinion that God was the author of evil. And the last named writer had even the courage to revoke in the Augsburg Confession his former doctrine. The latter formularies of the Lutherans are in perfect accordance with this amelioration in opinion. But it was quite otherwise with the Swiss reformers, who remained obstinately addicted to their errors. The importance of the subject calls upon us to describe at greater length the nature of their opinions. In his writing on Providence addressed to the Landgrave Philip of Hesse in the year 1530, Zwingli asserts that God is the author, mover, and impeller to sin, that also he makes the sinner, that by the instrumentality of the creature he produces injustice, and the like. In numberless places, Calvin uses the expression, man, at the instigation of God, doeth that what is unlawful to do. By a mysterious divine inspiration, the heart of man turneth to evil. Man falleth because the providence of God so ordaineth. If these principles fill us with just detestation, they were pushed still further by Theodore Beza, although what he brought forward was only deduction, and indeed a necessary deduction from the doctrines just adduced. This leader of the Reformed, after Calvin's death, is not satisfied with repeating that God incites, impels, and urges to evil, but he even adds that the Almighty creates a portion of men as his instruments, with the intent of working evil through them. The reasoning attempted in support of these notions is quite of a character with them. in order to show that God, although he urged to wicked actions, doth nevertheless not sin, but only man, Zwingli observes, God as the just one is subject to no law, for it is written, the law is not given for the just. Thus, should God make an angel or man transgress the law, cum transgressorum facit, he himself doth not transgress it, but the creatures whom the law oppresses and accuses. A more pitiable train of reasoning it would be impossible to invent, whether we consider the notion which Zwingli here gives of the just man, or according to the meaning of the passage in St. Paul adverted to, the just man is in himself the living moral law, and therefore does not stand in a mere extraneous relation to its precepts, but bears them in himself and constantly fulfills them, or whether we look to the essence of the deity, from whose wisdom and holiness the moral law is only an emanation, and which in pure and eternal glory he realizes, or whether lastly we contemplate the moral law in itself alone, which Zwingli, however much he may incidentally exalt it, treats as an arbitrary and merely positive code. The reformer of Zurich completely destroys the objectiveness of evil, and has not a perception of a holy moral government of the world, even in those passages where he seems to speak in such a sense. For these reasons he did not perceive that, if God were to impel to the transgression of a moral law given by himself, he would then be in contradiction with himself and would violate his own nature, and not merely an outward rule. That is to say, the reformer did not see that this theory destroyed the very notion of the deity. The injurious influence of this doctrine on public morality is evident of itself, and was strongly represented to Calvin. Zwingli still endeavours to justify his unhappy doctrine by the pretense that God is ever guided by pure intentions, that consequently the end sanctifies the means, and in a somewhat strange connection with this matter, he adds that David's adultery, whereof God was the author, could as little convict God of a bad action as when a bull impregnates a whole herd of cows. Here he only overlooks the circumstance that man is no more a cow than God is a bull. That accordingly, if man had been instigated by God to adultery, this could not occur without a violation of man's moral nature, and consequently the guilt would revert to God. Zwingli's conception, more nearly examined, consists herein that God wrought on the sensuality of David, which by its power overmastered his will, that in consequence God performed only the outward work indifferent in itself, and not the evil in it, the work which in the nuptial union as well as in adultery is identical. But how could he distinguish between the temptations of Satan and such an agency as here described? Reverting to the observation which Zwingli deemed calculated to justify the deity, that in alluring to bad actions God had good objects in view, it must be said that this notion was shared by Calvin and Beza, though by the latter it was put forth with more acuteness. Hence it will be our duty to state the opinions of these two reformers. Calvin admits that the opinion, according to which God determines man to moral corruption and impels him to sin, is not compatible with the known will of the deity. Hence, like Luther in his book against Erasmus, he has recourse to a hidden will of God, whereby his mode of proceeding is indeed very just, though its equity be not obvious to our perception. If this be the ordinary way wherein Calvin in his institutions seeks to defend himself, in his instruction against the so-called libertines, who, evidently induced by his own and Zwingli's writings, had denied the distinction between good and evil, and placed redemption in the knowledge obtained through Christ, that no distinction exists between the two, he still labours to show the great difference existing between the act of God and the act of the impious in one and the same deed. So, he says, God works to exercise justice, while the wicked man is actuated by avarice, covetousness, etc. God, for instance, instigates a man to murder, but from no other motive than to punish a crime committed. We leave it to the judgment of everyone whether the employment of such means be compatible with the very notion of the deity, and how extremely pernicious it would be, and subversive of all human morality, were men herein to imitate the deity so represented. But it is evident that the inquiry must here be carried back as far as the fall of man, and the question arises, what share is to be allotted to God in that event? Calvin never thinks of deducing the fall of Adam from the abuse of human freedom, but on the contrary, in perfect accordance with his own fundamental principles, he admits that God had ordained the fall and by an eternal decree brought it about. In Beza we find these monstrous errors pushed to still further length. The principal points of his reasoning are as follows. God wished on one hand to show mercy and on the other to reveal his justice. Adam was created morally just and holy, for from God's hand nothing unclean can come forth. But how could God unfold his mercies, since the sinner only can be the subject of these? How could he manifest his justice if no one committed wrong and thereby incurred punishment? Hence, for the unfolding of these attributes, the deity must prepare a channel which was found in ordaining the fall of the first man. These divine objects being perfectly just and holy, their quality is transmitted to the means also selected for their execution. Here Beza does not speak of a mere cooperation of the deity in the performance of the mere outward part in an evil action. For God, whether to punish or to exercise mercy, has regard to the inward evil sentiment, since without this sin is not possible. It was thus the part of the deity to call forth somehow an evil sentiment in order to attain his ends. That is to say, he must annihilate his sanctity in order on its ruins to attain to compassion and justice. Hence, Beza does not deny that the first man, when he sinned, succumbed under an invincible destiny, that it was thus not left to his freedom to abstain from sin. But, like Luther and Calvin, distinguishing between necessity and compulsion, he says the latter does not occur in sin, that on the contrary Adam sinned willingly with an inward pleasure, spontaneo motu, in opposition to libero and voluntario motu, and although he was not able to avoid sinning, he did not wish to avoid it, and it was this very thing which constituted his criminality. It is by these principles that passages in the Reformed confessions are to be estimated. They all assert that God is not the author of sin, that is to say, in the sense wherein Zwingli, Calvin, and Beza attempt to exculpate the deity after having denied man's free will.